So here's the point when we give this presentation live that we have people brainstorm about what the purpose of public schools in the US is. And it's always kind of interesting to see the wide variety of things that people think of, and all of them are true on some level. We often hear about basic academics. We usually hear about some sort of common unifying experience. You know, in my age, if you remember in gym class when we had parachute day, where they put the big parachute and you sit on it and it makes a bubble on the inside, that's a common experience. I'm sure some of you are like, oh my gosh, I love parachute day. That's what we mean by common unifying experience. But it also can mean things deeper about societal norms and things like that. Public schools often serve as community services or centers. Think about a lot of places offer voting. So your voting, your polling location may be in a school, but also things like when COVID happened, one of our schools locally became a place where people could pick up meals. So it really is that community idea. Civic education is one that some people don't think of, but it's a really important piece. If we're an informed electorate and we're governing ourselves as democracies do, then we need some civic education that is common among all of us. And then moral and societal norms. So this kind of goes back to that common or unifying experience. But, you know, when I look at my my kindergartner, part of what they're learning, part of their curriculum is about sharing, is about communicating. It's about, you know, how do we interact with one another? It's learning about the United States and our history and the values of freedom and democracy. So it's those moral and societal norms too. The point of this is that public schools have always had a big place in our communities. So really quickly, we're going to talk about the history of public schools in the US. So when we first got here, it was really a mix of things. There were certain places that wanted schooling, and so they might have started a school, but it was not widely accessible. As we got into the 1780s, and you know, with the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers realized that we needed an informed electorate, and part of that was that need to educate citizens. So this led to this idea of public schools. However, it was not widely accepted. Jurisdictions were all over the place. It really did vary based on where you were at. It wasn't until the 1830s when we came to this idea of what we really think of as the American public school, also called the common school. And this movement was led by Horace Mann in Massachusetts. And he identified education as a public investment just as much as a personal investment. And so Massachusetts really did start the first universally available state-funded public schools, which is now the model we use across the country. In the late 1800s, there was some uneven expansion. You know, different states chose to do different things. When Nebraska became a state in our Constitution, it is required to provide education for every student. But access and what that looked like varied greatly, particularly between rural and urban schools. In the early 1900s, there was this really interesting push and pull. So on one token, schools really became a place of assimilation. There was a huge influx of immigrants from Europe, and public schools became the place to learn about American culture, how to be an American. What's interesting is at that same time, there was an even more of a push towards segregation. So certain races, classes, all sorts of things, separating those so that there could be some control on the different access that folks had. So it was a really interesting push and pull. In the 1960s, this is when a lot of people think about some of our most hallmark, most respected and valued education policy. So this was during the Civil Rights Movement. And this is when Brown versus the Board of Education, which basically outlawed segregation. It said separate but equal, which was the previous ruling, was not actually possible. You can't do that. So there's no segregation in schools. And a lot of times people think of this as a racial civil rights movement, and that's a big portion of it, but it also related to access for those with disabilities and other sorts of integration and trying to make that educational equity across the country. And then finally, the most recent shift in the history of public schools is towards this idea of accountability and competition. As we have evolved as a society and more technology is available, we've been able to test more regularly. We've been able to compare things easier, which has kind of led to this, this idea that schools need to be held accountable. The No Child Left Behind Act really formalized that, but it also provided this new way of teaching, because if the focus is on the outcome, does it matter how it's taught, which is the rise of charter schools and some private schools and things like that. So this is the context of where we're at now.